Before agriculture was invented, before animals had been domesticated, and way before people started traveling by boats or conquering empires, our early ancestors lived in the Paleolithic era as hunter-gatherers. The lineage Homo lived during the period between 2.5 million to about 12,000 years ago, a period also known as the Stone Age. For millions of years in this environment, hunter-gatherer groups of ancient hominids, such as Homo habilis, Homo erectus, or Homo sapiens, ate foods that they could find in nature. They didn't have refrigerators or giant supermarkets filled with their favorite types of starchy products or deli meats. Our prehistoric ancestors had to band together in social hunting and gathering groups to scavenge, hunt, fish, or gather their food from the wild. Even though hunter-gatherers had to consistently work for every next meal, many times food acquisition was an easy task. But there were many circumstances when food was scarce and they were forced to endure long and excruciating periods of famine. During many of these famines, numerous individuals died, and with them, so did their genetic legacy. Without any refrigerators or grains that they could store for future use, the risk of starvation was always looming. Unlike the Christian Bible, which claims that humans were formed by God out of dust, we now understand that it was this Paleolithic time period and the environmental pressures that our evolutionary ancestors faced that actually molded and shaped us into the apex large-game hunting predators that we became. Our prehistoric ancestors lived before the Industrial and Agricultural Revolution, a time when many of the foods that we now consider to be staples, such as rice, bread, milk, potatoes, or corn, were non-existent. In this Paleolithic environment, prehistoric people were not eating the standard American diet that many think is normal. They were not eating pancakes covered in high-fructose corn syrup for breakfast every morning, or feeding their children ultra-processed cereals or other high-starchy foods that are now commonly consumed and making everyone sick. It's understandable that these low-quality foods have been part of the standard human diet since they are more affordable and readily available. However, it's only been a little over 300 generations ago, or 12,000 years, since every human alive was subsisting on foods that they could find in nature. Nevertheless, we have completely forgotten what a proper human diet should consist of. Be that as it may, the dependency that our Homo lineage evolved with nature for millions of years still remains within us. It is woven into the fabric of our genes. With this said, what they evolved to eat remains relevant. Even though it's impossible to ever recreate a true Paleolithic diet, since many of the plants and animals that our prehistoric ancestors were consuming have long gone extinct, plenty remains to be learned from the prehistoric human diet. We can learn about the foods we ought to be avoiding, and just as important, about the foods Mother Nature intended for us to eat. Grains, for example, were not part of the ancestral diet prior to the Agricultural Revolution. Grains only became a food source for us around 12,000 years ago. Before that, grains were virtually absent from the Paleolithic diet. Sure, from time to time, a few of our ancestors were able to find and gather some undomesticated grains and consume them, but generally, grains were rarely eaten because they were difficult to process and digest. They have always been a low-quality and nutrient-devoid food, and our ancestors knew that, so they ignored them. And since grains had been virtually absent from the ancestral diet for the majority of our existence, our bodies have not adapted to process grains properly. Instead of providing us with nutrition, grains have been wreaking havoc on our gastrointestinal systems since we started consuming them. Although grains are very tasty, they are not the superfood that we've been led to believe. Grains provide little nutritional benefits and contain various types of anti-nutrients. Corn, for example, contains phytic acid and lectins, which are food inhibitors that impair nutrient and mineral absorption. More specifically, phytic acid binds to iron, potassium, and inhibits absorption of these important nutrients. Corn also contains high amounts of lectins, which are proteins also found in most legumes and whole grains that bind to fiber in the small intestine and also interfere with the absorption of other important nutrients like calcium, iron, phosphorus, and zinc. Over time, these lectins can cause malnutrition and many health problems such as intestinal ulcers. Leaky gut is a debilitating condition caused by the gluten found in many grains, and it has shown to be a precursor for many serious autoimmune diseases such as Hashimoto's disease, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, and many other autoimmune problems. For example, a piece of whole wheat bread, which is made from grains, can provide us with more B vitamins than if we ate a piece of white bread. However, both options have many anti-nutritional properties that can harm our immune system. The gluten found in various types of grains causes mild forms of gastrointestinal inflammation to severe chronic gastrointestinal problems for a good portion of the population. For those individuals that develop full-blown autoimmune issues, the inflammation is first caused by a condition called leaky gut. This is a condition where the lining of the intestines develops large cracks or openings that allow microbes and gluten to penetrate the tissues that lie underneath. These harmful substances are absorbed into the bloodstream and cause inflammation. But the good news is that just like our Paleolithic ancestors, we too are perfectly capable of living healthy lives without ever consuming a single grain in our lives. For the same amount of energy found in grains, regular fresh fruits and vegetables, which were part of the ancestral diet although in small amounts, provide a superior source of nutrients than grains. For most people, eating a piece of fruit or having a small salad will always be a healthier choice than eating a so-called healthy bowl of cereal or a piece of toast every morning. Ditching grains from our diet altogether or even reducing this nutrient-devoid cellulose to less than 15% of our diet will likely improve problems associated with intestinal permeability, hormonal imbalances, autoimmune diseases, insulin resistance, and other metabolically related health conditions. Sure, we now live in a time of rapid change with modern societies, and unlike our Stone Age ancestors, we now have huge skyscrapers, self-driving cars, and Amazon Prime. But this doesn't mean that our bodies have evolved at this same expedited pace. Given the spectacular cities and sophisticated technologies that we now have, it is important to keep in mind that cultural evolution occurs much faster than biological evolution. Even though we have continued to biologically evolve since our Paleolithic era, our DNA has changed very little from that of our ancient forebears. Our genetic makeup continues to be almost identical to that of our prehistoric ancestors. For example, humans are still metabolically wired in the same way that our early hominid ancestors were, even dating as far back as Homo erectus. We all share the same reduced gut size that our ancient hominid ancestors evolved millions of years ago when climate change unwillingly moved these earlier Australopithecines away from the forested trees and into the open grasslands. The cooler grasslands caused many plant foods, such as fruits and seeds, to now grow seasonally instead of being available all year round, so they were forced to find new sources of food. Many pre-hominids like Paranthropus boise, nicknamed the Nutcracker Man for its large teeth, became extinct because this group became too reliant on plant-based foods. As their specific plant foods became ever more scarce, they eventually failed to find enough food to keep themselves alive. They ultimately failed to adapt to the rapidly changing and dispassionate environment. However, another group of more enterprising Australopithecines that began accessing nutrient-dense foods that came from animals survived. Over time, their bodies had to adapt to their new environment. They were first using grasping climbing techniques, But as they began spending less and less time in the forested trees and more time on the ground searching and finding animal foods, their reliance on walking upright grew. The need to break down and digest mainly plant foods was reduced, and with this reduction in plant-based foods, their large chewing muscles, teeth, and gut size also shrank. The pre-hominid Australopithecines that successfully branched away from the forested trees and began exploring animal foods, even on rare occasions, eventually led to the Homo lineage. Millions of years later, the shorter digestive systems that these early hominids evolved can still be found in modern humans. This is because we have inherited their genetic adaptations and thus the same nutritional requirements. By studying certain anatomical and physiological characteristics, such as gut size and how it operates, we can learn a lot about the kinds of foods that we evolved to eat and inadvertently what kinds of foods can optimize our health. Although gorillas are technically considered an omnivore species and are genetically similar to humans, they have a very different digestive system. They have a bigger gut size with larger and longer intestines that evolved specifically to digest large amounts of bulky fibrous plant foods by way of fermentation. This hindgut digestive system allows gorillas to easily process their food in their large intestine instead of in their small intestines or in their stomachs. Gorillas, along with most other large-bodied primates with their sizable colons, are perfectly capable of converting their low-quality plant-based cellulose food into molecules that they can use as energy and as building blocks for tissues. In fact, consuming large amounts of tough, fibrous plant food is the optimal diet for these amazing creatures, even though they can at times eat some small animals. Their guts have a difficult time digesting and processing animal foods. Like gorillas, humans are also technically capable of consuming an omnivorous diet, but unlike gorillas, consuming heavy fibrous foods is not optimal for our health. Humans are incapable of digesting cellulose because the digestive tract of humans is anatomically different than that of gorillas or other animals such as chimpanzees, which consume large amounts of low-quality, high-fibrous foods. Our smaller large intestine makes it difficult to ferment cellulose into usable energy. Most of our food is processed in our small intestine with the help of enzymes that help break down foods. Consuming large quantities of fibrous foods can cause health complications beyond bloating, gas, pain, and constipation. It can cause nutrient deficiencies since cellulose interferes with our ability to absorb important nutrients. Even though many people believe that fiber is the super ingredient that can protect them from all their digestive issues, this is simply not the case. A high amount of fiber consumption is associated with many digestive problems such as colon cancer, diverticulosis, and other large intestinal diseases. Counter to what many medical doctors still believe, diverticulitis, for example, occurs when people consume too much fiber and have increased bowel movements. Humans are simply not supposed to produce huge excrements several times a day. We don't have the large intestine capable of processing copious amounts of fiber. Doing so can cause our large intestine to become inflamed, infected, and ultimately diseased. We might not like this, but our digestive system, with our reduced colon and our small cecum, mostly resembles the digestive tract of a dog or a pig. These animals are carnivorous animals with the ability to consume an omnivorous diet. But there's a huge difference with being able to consume an omnivorous diet and what is optimal for our health. Dogs can eat bread, but should they? I find it sad when I see dogs being fed kibble instead of animal-based foods. Kibble is primarily made from grains and other high-starch carbohydrates like rice, potatoes, and wheat. I understand that it's an affordable option, but I believe many people do not realize that this low-cost and low-quality grain-based dog food comes with a heavy price. Kibble creates many metabolic issues for our wolf-descendant friends. It spikes their insulin, glucagon, and cortisol levels throughout the day and is a reason why many dogs are now experiencing obesity, among other diseases like diabetes that were previously only seen in modern humans. If this sounds familiar, it's because it is. Just because we can eat cereal or dessert for breakfast every single day does not mean we should. The digestive enzymes in humans can also inform us on the types of foods that we evolved to eat. Gastric acid is a fluid that is secreted by the lining of our stomachs to help break down the foods we consume. It's made up of several components like hydrochloric acid, water, pepsin, and several other things. But the important point about human gastric acid is the pH level. The average pH level of 1.5 found in the gastric acid of most humans is much lower than in most animals, including other primates. This is a stomach acid with a higher concentration of hydrochloric acid that is perfectly capable of killing pathogens found in rotting meat. It's a very useful and powerful substance to have evolved in our stomachs if we spent a lot of time as scavengers consuming decaying flesh in the evolutionary past. Other animals with a similar gastric pH level as humans are vultures and other carrion eating animals. In contrast to having a low gastric pH level are animals such as llamas or kangaroos that produce higher pH level gastric juices. Their higher pH gastric levels of about 4 and 5 are typical of herbivores. Herbivores do not need to produce low pH gastric acid levels because they aren't exposed to the pathogenic bacteria found in wild decomposing carcasses. It is widely known that among Arctic and subarctic foragers such as the Inuit, the consumption of putrid meat, fish, and fat have been part of their traditional diet for as long as they've existed. Putrefied meat is partially decomposed meat. The meat has an offensive smell for members not accustomed to this traditional food, but what's often unappreciated is that putrefied meat is partially pre-digested meat that is now softer and easier to digest without needing to use fire to cook it. Eating putrid meat makes perfect sense in the Arctic where there aren't many pieces of wood to cook with lying around. However, historic accounts also tells us that the practice of eating putrefied animal foods has been widespread among many hunter-gatherers found in hot and humid areas of the world like in sub-Saharan Africa or in the Congo Basin. Khoisan hunter-gatherers from the South African coast have been observed by 17th century Dutch colonists to store scavenged whale meat and blubber in pits so they can consume it at a later time. Putrefied meat can be preserved safely and stored for months, but it also contains higher levels of vitamin C than cooked meat. This keeps the northern groups of people from developing scurvy since they live in regions of the world where fruit and vegetables that contain high levels of vitamin C are unavailable. Eating putrid meat is not a rare practice, but rather a custom that has been used by many populations since our prehistoric ancestors began scavenging animal foods. In modern Sweden, for example, putrefied herring fish that they call surströmming is left to ferment for at least 6 months. Although it produces a strong, pungent smell that leads many to consume this dish outdoors, they consider it a delicacy. In short, humans have evolved a natural meat disinfectant in order to avoid food poisoning while eating decaying animal flesh that had been laying around in the sun for a while. The digestive tract that Mother Nature gave us evolved because the consumption of a high animal diet has been in place since the origin of our genus Homo. With the help of stone tools, our early Stone Age ancestors were able to adapt to their new way of life. Tools played a massive role in the kinds of foods they were able to find in more open habitats. These simple but clever pieces of technology became indispensable because in the absence of fangs and claws, these tools increased our ancestors' survivability as well as their scavenging and hunting capabilities. With these simple stone technologies, they were now able to compete with other incredible and powerful animals that were previously above their league. Anthropological evidence has found that our earliest Homo ancestor called Homo habilis was already using stone tools to access animal foods. Many of these crude weapons and knives have been found in the fossil record with clear cut marks that indicate they were specifically used to extract bone marrow and to butcher and to disarticulate animal remains. In Tanzania, Africa, there's an important paleoanthropological site called Olduvai Gorge. Here, thousands of animal bones with cut marks where the meat had been defleshed with crude stone tools have been found. Additionally, in various sites around the world, spear-like Clovis points lodged in the vertebra or ribs of large animals like antelope, buffalo, and kangaroos, including megafauna like woolly mammoths, have also been found. Stone tools helped us dig out tubers, process some lower quality plant foods, but more importantly, they helped us access difficult to acquire animal foods. There's paleoanthropological evidence that suggests that by 1.7 million years ago, Homo erectus was already fully capable of hunting medium to large-sized animals. But long before becoming apex predators, our earlier ancestors began their animal food acquisition as scavengers working in small social groups. Scavenging carcasses left over by other predators, like lions or wolves, gave our prehistoric ancestors access to caloric-rich foods that they didn't have access to before. With their handy tools like anvils and hammers, they were able to break open large and thick bones to find the delicious fatty bone marrow deposited within. They could also access small traces of meat surrounding the leftover bones. But most importantly, they now also had gained access to an important and rare superfood: the glistening fatty brains inside left behind skulls. But these opportunistic scavengers needed to be clever and arrived to a kill site before other scavengers like hyenas or vultures got there. Their urgency to get to a recently killed carcass before other scavengers likely created an evolutionary adaptive pressure for persistent scavenging. They were under pressure to get to the site quicker and before other hungry scavengers arrived, because if they didn't, they would have simply been left without food. This likely resulted in a selection for the improvement of persistence hunting capabilities that put them on a new hunting path that eventually led to their extraordinary abilities as apex predators. For a more in-depth explanation on this topic, look for the link in the description for my video called Early Hominids from Scavengers to Persistence Hunters. This new diet, with its rich fatty bone marrow, smooth buttery brains, and bits of meat, provided them with a complete nutrient, protein, and fatty acid profile. This was a complete meal with all the essential building blocks that they required for staying in perfect health. When times were good and they had plenty of animal foods, they didn't need any plant-based foods to survive. There are no essential nutrients in plant foods that they couldn't get from animal foods alone. Even vitamin C can be accessed from animal foods. It's found in raw liver, fish roe, in eggs, and in small amounts of raw meat and fish. And since they didn't have to grow large claws or ferocious teeth to obtain these animal foods, because they had handy tools, the extra energy intake procured by the fatty bone marrow provided them with plenty of fuel to grow and develop other features, such as growing a larger body size with longer legs for running and a larger brain. As successful scavengers, they were now consuming less plant foods and plenty of animal-derived foods. They were becoming more specialized, and so the species evolved bodies that fit this niche. Soon, after members of the genus Homo diverged from chimpanzees, the powerful masticatory muscles that are found in most primates, like in chimpanzees or gorillas, were also significantly reduced. Their molar teeth got smaller, and they also ditched their huge, clumsy gut because they no longer needed to process high volumes of low nutrient and tough fibrous foods. This reduction in colon size occurred concurrently with a significant growth in brain size. Their consumption of scavenged brain tissue specifically contained two special kinds of performed fatty acids: omega-3 fatty acids called DHA and omega-6 fatty acids known as AA. These two types of performance fatty acids happen to be the major building blocks for brain growth. The consumption of brain tissue was the special ingredient that ultimately fueled their encephalization. Without the dietary consumption of bone marrow for energy and of the DHA and AA fatty acids, the brain expansion of these opportunistic scavengers would have never occurred. These early primates were already using fire and were able to cook foods. Cooking foods further increased the nutrient absorption of the already high energetic animal foods that they were consuming. This caused their bodies and brains to continue to grow even larger. To get an idea, the brain of Homo sapiens is about 3 times larger than the brain of a chimpanzee, which happens to be our closest relative. But as with everything, there had to be a trade-off. Brain tissue is metabolically expensive to maintain, and so is having a large gut. Compared to body size, they had now evolved the largest brain of any other animal in existence. In particular, the brain grew more gray matter, which is the part of the brain that's associated with higher cognitive capabilities. But it also uses up a lot of energy. This larger brain only weighs about 2% of our body mass, but at a resting state, every day consumes about 20% of the caloric energy needed. Leslie Aiello and Peter Wheeler proposed the expensive tissue hypothesis in 1992, where they argued that since the human brain overwhelmingly stands out from other animals due to its large size, the metabolic requirements of having a large brain could only be achieved by an almost perfect trade-off between brain size and gut size. And this is exactly the trade-off that we see in the fossil record. If an animal's going to have a small gut, it better have a nutrient-dense diet that is easy to digest. These early primates had to depend heavily on animal foods for survival because these were the only types of foods they could digest and the only foods capable of providing them with the right nutrients and energy to sustain their metabolically expansive brain. Additionally, there's evidence that shows that hunter-gatherers didn't have a good genetic adaptation to break down starchy foods such as tubers before 20,000 years ago. The salivary amylase gene AMY1 improves the digestion and breakdown of starchy foods and glycogen, but more copies of this gene only showed up in the human genome recently, likely when the megafauna became extinct and humans were forced to supplement their diet with a bit more starchy foods. This means that our early ancestors would have had a difficult time sustaining themselves from plant foods alone because it was difficult for them to digest starchy foods. Not seeking and consuming high-quality and nutrient-dense foods in the wild would have been the difference between life and death. This is why no hunter-gatherer groups of people that primarily ate an all-plant-based diet has ever been discovered. Those that tried to consume an exclusive all-plant-based diet quickly died due to vitamin, nutrient, and/or caloric deficiencies. To be more specific, our evolutionary ancestors were consuming some plant-based foods when they had to. But animal fat was the true and only substance in nature that was capable of providing enough fuel to sustain their metabolically expensive brain. There has been a discovery of approximately 400 cave paintings found in different parts of the world. Many of the cave art depict animals such as mammoths, rhinos, lions, bison, reindeer, horses, and many other large animals. Most of the animals depicted in these cave paintings are huge and fat. It doesn't take much to realize that these cave paintings of large animals that are often being chased by little stickmen holding hunting weapons represent animals that were highly prized in a hunt. Animals that were roaming around with fat pockets in a landscape where fat was scarce. The fatter the animal, the more desirable they were. As many people have pointed out, there are no cave paintings of salads, kale, or broccoli around, and there's a good reason why. Plants can be nutritious to some extent and medicinal, and they are important survival foods, but they have always been nutritionally inferior to animal foods. Counter to what some people claim, kale is not a superfood, especially when compared to a regular chicken egg or compared to any other animal-based foods. The caloric content of plants is approximately 1/10 of the caloric content found in animal foods. With some basic calculations, in the evolutionary past, it is easy to see that it would have been a waste of energy gathering only plant foods or even going after small animals such as wild hares because they provided inferior nutrition and a lower energy content for the amount of effort that it would have taken to catch, gather, or process these foods. Of course, plant foods and small animals were still being consumed, especially when the effort to obtain these foods was low or when larger, beefier animals were unattainable. Plant foods have always been important in the ancestral diet. Plants got us out of trouble when large animals could not be hunted down. Plant foods have always been great supplemental and fallback foods, but they were never preferred over large game meat. Some anthropologists that have studied modern tribes try to argue that because tribes such as the Hasda from central Tanzania or the hunter-gatherers from Papua New Guinea consume a lot of plant-based foods today, that this must mean that Paleolithic people likely ate this way. Modern tribes are not living fossils. Yes, current hunter-gatherers from Papua New Guinea primarily subsist on high amounts of carbohydrates. About 70% of their diet primarily comes from the starchy wild sago palm because it's abundantly available and because it's easy to obtain, but it's important to note that they also supplement their diet with animal foods when they can. Current tribes are now living in marginalized environments and they no longer have the same environment and the same foods that our Stone Age ancestors had. The very large animals are completely gone and the biota has changed significantly. Of course, when these superior foods are no longer available, people will be forced to subsist on lower quality foods. If they had access to the megafauna that our prehistoric ancestors had, it's likely that they would have exploited the environment in the same exact way that our earlier ancestors did. To get an idea of what the prehistoric diet consisted of, a study performed by Christoph Weibing et al. In 2019 used the stable isotopic approach to find out what Neanderthals and Upper Paleolithic modern humans from the Goyet caves in Belgium were eating. They found that the Neanderthals and the Upper Paleolithic modern humans were consuming a similar hypercarnivorous diet that consisted of mainly large terrestrial herbivore mammals. The two most preyed upon species was mammoth and reindeer. These were the largest animals available in that area. The behavioral patterns in food acquisition of these two groups of people are consistent with the behavioral ecological model called optimal foraging strategy, which predicts how animals behave when they are searching for food. Animals always adopt foraging strategies that provide them with the most energy for the least amount of effort. Basically, it pays off to take down a large animal if the energy and the risks to hunt them down are lower than the energy that they will gain. Unlike the scavengers from millions of years ago, modern hunter-gatherers had perfected their hunting craft, even though they were still using simple hunting technologies. With weapons such as balanced wooden spears or stone-tipped weapons fire and hunting dogs, these top predators were hunting down the biggest and fattest animals that they could potentially find. Sometimes they were using persistence hunting to run down ungulates to exhaustion, and other times they were luring incredible large animals like woolly mammoths into deep cliffs. Bison, humongous aurochs with their massive elongated broad horns, and even dangerous megafauna like woolly rhinos were fair game. Unlike other carnivorous animals that target weak and vulnerable prey because they're easier to catch, our ancient ancestors were not interested in the weaklings from the herd. They wanted the fattest and biggest animals that they could find because intuitively they understood that protein without sufficient amounts of fat was detrimental to their health. Our ancestors innately recognized that eating lean meats would make them sick. They would have suffered from protein toxicity, which occurs when too much lean meat is consumed. More than 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day will quickly poison us. Protein poisoning is also known as rabbit starvation or fat starvation, a name derived from the fact that rabbit meat has very low amounts of fat, and anyone trying to survive on rabbit meat alone would die from rabbit starvation. Eating high levels of lean protein from any animal will cause symptoms such as feeling weak, nauseated, lightheaded. It causes loose stool and can eventually cause death. Smaller animals usually have less fat than larger animals, and this is why it has always been important for hunter-gatherers to target and hunt the largest animals that they could find. Organs, in particular, were highly sought out because they provided essential nutrients that muscle meat alone did not. Yes, muscle meat was also important due to its caloric, protein, and nutrient content. But the truly prized items were organ meats and the precious fat. These are the parts of the animal that would have been consumed first. Organs such as the liver were treated like a precious jewel. They were often given to the hunter that brought down the animal, evenly shared, or given to a pregnant woman. Our ancestors instinctually understood that organ meat was more nutrient dense than muscle meat. Now we have a good understanding that organ meats have a higher content of fat and are rich in B vitamins such as vitamin B12, vitamin A, D, E, K, and folate. And they're also rich in minerals like iron, magnesium, selenium, and zinc, with sufficient amounts of vitamin C as well. Organ meat is higher in energy and more nutrient dense than muscle meat alone, but ultimately no part of the animal was wasted. Hunter-gatherers were eating the brain, the tongue, nose fat, liver, the kidneys, gonads, the spleen, the thymus, tendons, etc. They were consuming every part of the animal from nose to tail. The female animals were preferred due to their higher level of fat content, and if she was carrying a fetus, that fetus would have been consumed as well. Animal food was highly prized not only because of the energy that it provided, but also because of its nutrient density. Of course, early humans also ate some fish and shellfish and gathered some plant foods, but they primarily hunted large terrestrial, hoofed animals and megafauna when they were available. They exploited every landscape all the way until most of the large animals eventually became extinct. Although this is still being contested, many archaeologists attribute the extinction of megafauna to humans hunting them. The high level of predation was too fast for the large animals to replenish their population, since they produced at a slower pace than small animals like rabbits. Research shows that during the Pleistocene, there was a 90% drop in the average of body size of terrestrial mammals. It's very likely that this drop in body size was due to the large-scale hunting practices performed by hunter-gatherers. Everywhere humans traveled to in the world, the extinction of megafauna followed. These large game hunters preyed on huge and dangerous animals so successfully that they likely killed them out of existence. The very few large animals such as giraffes and elephants that remain in existence are only around because governments have implemented restrictions against hunting them. As a result of these hunting practices, the ecology and biota has been impacted significantly. And sadly, later hunter-gatherer populations inherited an environment with small number of megafauna, but also an environment with different kinds of plant foods to consume. The extinction of the large game animals during the Pleistocene epoch that they depended upon for food created an adaptive pressure for humans in all parts of the world to create culture. When the megafauna was abundant, there was no need to farm food. Our ancestors were clever enough to have done it probably hundreds of thousands of years prior. They just didn't care to grow plants because they had plenty of superior food to consume. But when this food source disappeared, something had to change. Even though hunter-gatherers were fully adapted to eating a hypercarnivorous diet with plenty of fat, they were forced to abandon their traditional lifestyle, and they began farming in different parts of the world around 12,000 years ago. This drastic event is known as the Agricultural Revolution. During the Agricultural Revolution, many grains such as wheat, corn, sorghum, barley, and rice, as well as some animals, were domesticated. Farming grains was a novel and important invention that gave our species control over the food supply and allowed them to survive. Their food was now predictable, and it could now be stored for long periods of time and used during food shortages. The consistency and abundance of these crops allowed women farmers to have children in faster intervals rather than in 3.5-year intervals from hunter-gatherer women. In no time, farmers outnumbered hunter-gatherer groups of people and the population exploded. Today, most people around the world heavily rely on these nutrient-devoid domesticated grains for their nutritional needs. Grains and the domestication of animals helped us survive the new environment that was now devoid of megafauna. Grains allowed us to replace the now scarce animal-derived fats for carbohydrates, but unfortunately our overall health began to crumble. When anthropologist Clark Spencer Larson was interviewed for an article written for National Geographic, he, in a disappointing manner, described the dawn of agriculture. He stated, "As the earliest farmers became dependent on crops, their diets became far less nutritionally diverse than hunter-gatherer diets. Eating the same domesticated grains every day gave early farmers cavities and periodontal disease rarely found in hunter-gatherers. When farmers began domesticating animals, those cattle, sheep, and goat became source of milk and meat, but also of parasites and of new infectious disease. Farmers suffered from iron deficiency and developmental delays, and they shrank in stature. Despite boosting population numbers, the lifestyle and diet of farmers were clearly not as healthy as the lifestyle and diet of hunter-gatherers. The fact that farmers produce more babies is simply evidence that you don't need to be disease-free to have children." Bones and teeth from hunter-gatherers that have been dug up by archaeologists have consistently shown to be healthier, to have better dentition, and to have fewer diseases than those belonging to farmers. Hunter-gatherers were not obese, they didn't have acne, clogged arteries, or cancer, and their children didn't have gum disease, diabetes, or non-alcoholic liver disease. If a hunter-gatherer survived childbirth or accidents, and if they made it to the age of 30, their likelihood of living well into their 70s or 80s was not uncommon, and this is without the help of modern medicine. The average life expectancy today in the US is approximately 77, and that's with the help of all the sophisticated modern technologies. Before the agricultural revolution, the height of Eastern Paleolithic Mediterranean men was about 5'11", but their average height fell to a little over 5'3" around 6,000 years ago. Luckily, their height recovered to about 5'8" around the time of the Industrial Revolution, but unfortunately, their health has not. Before the agricultural revolution, every human was eating a carnivorous diet with some plant-based foods here and there. But since then, we have severely diverged from the path that was designed by our forebears. And as a result, our population is now overfed but malnourished and confused about what a proper human diet should consist of. In a recent human perspective study performed by researchers at the University of North Carolina, the researchers found that 88% of Americans are now metabolically unfit. Similar accounts can be seen worldwide. This means that most people have poor metabolic health. They have a higher chance of developing diabetes, heart disease, or stroke if they haven't already. Utah professor and leading metabolic scientist Dr. Ben Bikman says that the metabolic problems of today are due to our diet. Humans are simply eating the wrong foods in the wrong quantities, and unfortunately this trend is consistently getting worse. From an anthropological perspective, it's clear that we're now consuming all the wrong foods. Foods that we didn't evolve to eat, foods that our bodies are ill-equipped to process. We are over-consuming copious amounts of refined carbohydrates, consuming drinks with pharmaceutical levels of sugar, while at the same time, our government guidelines encourages us to eat less healthy fats and proteins and more grains, even though the evidence suggests that the human body is designed to consume an animal-based diet. But luckily in 2015, the USDA finally retracted a harmful claim about saturated fat, which stated that the overconsumption of cholesterol causes health concerns. Now they are saying that cholesterol is not considered a nutrient of concern for overconsumption. But as a society, we have not fully recovered from the 70+ years of being told that cholesterol is harmful to our health. Anyone that does a quick Google search on saturated fat will quickly come across countless of articles that regurgitate the conventional wisdom about saturated fat, stating that the consumption of saturated fat increases heart disease, even though this claim fails to hold up to scientific scrutiny. For over 2 million years, our ancestors have been consuming extremely fatty animals with zero heart problems, but all of a sudden saturated fat has become something to be feared. This fear-mongering is oddly suspicious, given that cholesterol is essential for many bodily functions. Cholesterol is found in every single cell in our bodies, and it's important for signaling pathways, like those that trigger hormone production or those that signal satiety. Animal fat is important for fueling a rapid-growing infant brain. Evidence has shown that children on low-fat diets suffer from various developmental problems. That's because they're not accessing valuable fat-soluble vitamins such as vitamin A, D, E, and K2 that are strictly found in fatty animal foods. If humans did not evolve as carnivores, then why are there so many critical components to humans in animal fats? Vitamin A deficiency is a serious concern in many developing countries like India, where animal fat consumption is low. According to the UNICEF, about 1/3 of children in India have a vitamin A deficiency. This is a serious concern because vitamin A alone is important for relating many bodily functions like growth, reproduction, vision, and immunity. Vitamin K2, which is strictly found in fatty animal foods like in eggs or bacon, is important for cardiovascular health, calcium metabolism, and it plays an important role in blood clotting. Fat is essential to our health, and this is why it's no surprise to see that many ketogenic studies have shown to improve many metabolically related issues. The ketogenic diet consists of high fat, adequate protein, and low carbohydrate consumption. It has been used successfully as a therapy to treat illnesses for about 100 years. The earliest use of the ketogenic diet was used to treat children with epilepsy, and later ketogenic diets expanded to treat or put into remission a myriad of illnesses such as diabetes, obesity, chronic kidney disease, multiple sclerosis, mental illnesses, and other health issues involving hormones or neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease. Some scientific studies have indicated that when compared to low-fat diets, ketogenic diets such as the paleo diet, a keto diet, or a straight carnivore diet are superior for treating various illnesses. There's a reason for why ketogenic diets are consistently showing health benefits that range from weight loss to reversing or putting into remission a myriad of illnesses. It's because these ketogenic diets are anthropologically consistent with the prehistoric human diet. Like our Paleolithic ancestors, avoiding sugar, highly processed foods, and grains while eating a low-carb, high-fat, inadequate animal protein foods will bring us closer to the biologically appropriate human diet that we were meant to eat. Given the spectacular variation of foods that we now consume thanks to the clever use of fire, the agricultural revolution, the domestication of animals, and the technologies that developed during the Industrial Revolution, it is difficult to imagine that humans evolved as carnivores. But the evidence coming from various scientific disciplines tell us that the Homo lineage has been scavenging and hunting and consuming large fatty animals and in large amounts for millions of years, a behavior that is associated with hypercarnivory. Yes, we're capable of consuming a good variety of plant-based foods, and as opportunistic animals we were supplementing our diets with plants when it was necessary. However, just because we can consume plants doesn't mean that they are optimal for our health. Humans have not stopped evolving after the Paleolithic era. This means that subtle nuances in the way some people are able to digest the starch in grains and lactose in milk has occurred in a small percentage of people. However, even with these adaptations, grains and milk products are still causing metabolic issues for most people around the world. In the grand scheme of things, these recent genetic adaptations that are found in some people are negligible. Our DNA is virtually identical to that of our evolutionary ancestors, and our bodies still require a Paleolithic diet to live healthier lives. Before leaving Africa to conquer other lands, our African prehistoric ancestors had already developed a dependency on fatty animal foods to survive. They were well equipped with the physiology, skills, and brain power to dominate any foreign land that they encountered. Our adaptation to eating animal foods was a key factor to successfully migrate out of Africa, diffuse our population, and eventually colonize the planet. It would have been impossible for the pre-hominids to climb down from the trees to eventually leave the African savanna and then to go on to conquer other areas of the world. How could they have ever avoided starvation as herbivores in the frozen regions of the world where plants were impossible to grow? Of course, the answer is because they became reliant to eating an animal-based diet. Adopting a carnivorous diet was crucial since animals can be found in every colonized part of the world. Even though we didn't inherit the environment that our prehistoric ancestors had, we have managed to domesticate animals that contain a favorable fatty acid profile for our health. Grass-fed and grass-finished beef is currently the greatest source of macro and micronutrients that's currently in existence. These ethically sourced amazing creatures are the closest approximate food source that we have to the megafauna that our ancestors were consuming. It's not enough to eat foods that will barely keep us alive. It's about eating the biologically appropriate nutrition to help us avoid health complications, but also to help us attain optimal health. And for this to occur, we must take into account our prehistoric dietary needs. Given our current biology, it's essential for us to embrace a high-quality and minimally processed fatty animal-based diet with a low carbohydrate intake. The goal is to not only meet our nutritional demands, but to maximize our metabolic health. This way of eating is anthropologically and evolutionarily consistent, and just as important, it's the ancestral diet that Mother Nature intended for us to eat.